Before we start, please make sure to like, subscribe, and share this video with your friends and family. Also, can you please tell me from where and what time you're watching? Thanks.
It began with a gift on my porch, an unexpected and innocuous token, or so it seemed. The summer of 2019 was supposed to be a fresh chapter. I had just graduated with my master's degree and moved to a rural town for my PhD. My dad and I bought a modest house together, a practical investment we planned to rent out after my schooling. But no sooner had I settled in than the darkness lurking next door revealed itself. My dad quickly made friends at the bar, and everyone there seemed to sing the praises of my next-door neighbor, a man they described as the kindest, most generous soul around. I met him one afternoon. His demeanor was pleasant enough, and when he suggested exchanging numbers just in case, it felt harmless. It wasn't. The day my dad left to return home, the texts started. The first was simple. He'd left a gift on my porch. Confused but curious, I arrived home to find a hand-painted dish for my cats in the mailbox. Sweet, but a little odd. Then came the pet names, Sweetie, Cutie, casually woven into his messages. It felt off, so I politely told him I wasn't interested in anything romantic. His reply was a bizarre rant about friendship, claiming that's all he wanted. I hoped that would be the end of it. Spoiler, it wasn't. The next few weeks were a barrage of texts, gifts, and relentless invitations to go fishing or hang out. I tried to ignore most of it, replying occasionally to avoid outright conflict. After all, he was my neighbor. Then one night, everything shifted. The bar manager down the street messaged me out of the blue. "If your neighbor knocks on your door tonight, do not answer." My heart dropped. She explained that my neighbor had shown up at the bar, wielding a hatchet, claiming he could hear voices that got louder the closer he came. He threatened to kill someone if the voices didn't stop. The police were called, but to my disbelief, they confiscated the hatchet and let him go. The bar manager was so concerned for my safety that she picked me up, insisting I stay at her place that night. When I returned home the next day, a dead squirrel had appeared beside my car door. Its mangled body looked as though it had been deliberately placed there. Uneasy, I stepped over it and left. Hours later, the squirrel was gone, and I received a text from my neighbor. "Someone or something put a dead squirrel in your driveway. Don't worry, I moved it for you." I was certain he'd been the one to put it there in the first place. Soon other unsettling signs began appearing. One day, an unspent shotgun shell lay conspicuously on the bricks in his front yard. When I saw him outside, he casually mentioned that it was a warning for anyone walking between our houses. I stopped responding to his texts entirely, but that didn't stop him. He started building a massive wooden casket in his yard. Scribbled on its side in black paint were the words, "Here lies the last son of an expletive who played mind games." November 2012. The message was cryptic and chilling. My patience had worn thin. I filed a police report and began the process of getting a stalking no-contact order. By March 2020, the court granted the order. For a while, the situation improved. He still did strange things, talking to himself in his yard or pacing around, but it didn't seem dangerous. Then a few months later, he fell back into old habits. Another shotgun shell appeared, this time in my flower bed. I was sure it was meant as a threat toward my boyfriend, who had recently moved in. By New Year's 2021, his behavior reached a terrifying new level. I was jolted awake at 1 a.m. by screams. Turning on my security cameras, I saw him leaning out his window, shouting obscenities directly at my house. He called me a harlot and screamed that he was going to blow up his house using the gas line. I called the police, but their response was infuriating. "He didn't say your name, so it's not a violation of the protection order." Weeks later, his antics reached a fever pitch. One morning I heard him yelling in the alley behind my house, "Someone is going to die over this sweatshirt." He paced back and forth, shouting nonsensical threats and claiming he'd get his shotgun. Again, the police were called, but their response was a slap on the wrist, an ordinance violation for disturbing the peace. That night I was awoken by hammering sounds. Through my cameras I saw him tearing down his privacy fence, sawing it horizontally until it stood only 3 feet tall, leaving me exposed. I had reached my limit. My once peaceful home had become a nightmare. My boyfriend and I began looking for a new place, but the process was slow. I'm a PhD student with limited income, and renting wasn't an option with 6 animals between us. My dad agreed to co-sign a new mortgage, and I picked up a second job to save for the move. Until then, I'm stuck here, trapped in a house overshadowed by fear, frustration, and the haunting reality that safety can be so easily taken away. Every creak of the floorboards, every shadow in the yard, reminds me that I'm not safe. I don't know what else to do. I'm tired. I'm angry. And I just want to breathe again. The lock clicked softly behind me, and for the first time, I truly noticed how quiet the apartment felt. It wasn't the usual comforting silence of home. It felt heavy, watchful. A chill ran down my spine as I tried to shake off the unease. Little did I know that day would take a turn so sinister, it would haunt me for years to come. I live in a bustling city in Eastern Europe, the kind of place where life moves fast, and trouble often lurks just out of sight. My neighborhood had a reputation, shady characters, late-night shouting matches, and a fair share of vandalism. But nothing truly dangerous had ever happened to me. I'd grown up here, learning how to navigate the streets with a cautious eye and a quick instinct. It was a chilly New Year's Day. My dad had left around 3 p.m. for his usual ping-pong practice and would be out until late, grabbing beers with his buddies afterward. My mum and younger brother were helping a friend clean up after a wild New Year's Eve party. I was supposed to join them, but a pounding headache, courtesy of last night's festivities, kept me home. I tried to shake the guilty thought that staying behind was one of the best decisions I'd ever made. The evening passed uneventfully at first. Wrapped in a blanket, I rewatched episodes of Skins, UK version obviously, to distract myself. Around 6 p.m. my stomach growled, reminding me I hadn't eaten since morning. My go-to late-night supermarket was just a 5-minute walk away, and despite the freezing weather, I decided to head out. Bundled up in my coat and flip-flops, I trudged through the icy streets, the glow of the supermarket sign pulling me forward. But as I neared the automatic doors, a man caught my eye. He stood there, small and stocky, his clothes mismatched and unkempt, staring at the doors like he was guarding them. His presence felt off. "Is it still open?" I asked, my voice breaking the quiet. He pointed to a piece of paper taped next to the schedule. "Closed early for the holidays," it read. Annoyed, I sighed and turned to leave, but his voice stopped me. "There's a boutique nearby," he said, almost too eagerly. His tone was urgent, insistent. "Just a couple of minutes from here, you'll find what you need there." My gut twisted. There was something about the way he stared at me, unblinking, that set off alarms in my head. But I convinced myself I was overreacting. Maybe he was just trying to help, hoping for a tip or some kindness in return. I forced a polite nod and walked toward the boutique, my senses on high alert. The boutique was cramped but warm. I grabbed the first snack I saw, quickly paid, and exchanged hurried New Year's wishes with the shopkeeper before heading back. As I passed the supermarket again, I noticed something that sent a shiver down my spine. The man was gone. He'd been standing there when I left, and now, nothing. The street felt emptier, darker. My unease grew into full-blown paranoia as I picked up my pace, clutching the snack bag tightly. Reaching the front of my building, I spotted movement out of the corner of my eye. A tall, dark figure stepped into the elevator just as the automatic lights flickered off. My breath hitched. Fumbling with my keys, I unlocked the door and slipped inside, my heart pounding in my chest. The elevator was still moving, its numbers lighting up one by one. It stopped on the 5th floor. Forcing myself to breathe, I took the stairs. Logic told me I was overreacting, but fear had taken root. As I reached the 6th floor, I noticed the light was on. Strange. It should have been off by now. Then I saw it. The 7th floor light switched on. My stomach dropped. Whoever was in the elevator was now on my floor. I froze, praying they'd move on. But the light stayed on, unwavering. Summoning every ounce of courage, I bolted up the stairs, my legs trembling beneath me. When I reached my apartment, my blood ran cold. There he was, the dark figure, crouched at my door, fiddling with the lock. "Hey!" I managed to choke out, my voice trembling. He turned sharply, and I finally saw his face. Pale skin stretched tight over angular features, a crooked smile revealing yellowed teeth. His trench coat and gloves made him look like something out of a nightmare. His eyes locked onto mine, and for a moment time stood still. Then, without a word, he bolted. "Sorry," he muttered as he disappeared down the stairs, his footsteps echoing in the silence. I stood there, paralyzed, staring at the lock. A thin pin was still wedged inside. My hands shook as I fumbled for my phone, dialing my parents. They promised to come home immediately and told me to call the police. While I waited, a kind neighbor from the 2nd floor came up to keep me company. The officers arrived shortly after, their calm demeanor a stark contrast to the chaos in my mind. I recounted everything, describing the man at the supermarket and the lockpicker. The details felt hazy, my memory distorted by fear. They took the pin as evidence and assured me they'd increase patrols in the area. That night, as I lay in bed clutching a bat, I couldn't shake the image of his smile, the way it twisted, hungry and cruel. One thing was clear, I'd never ignore my instincts again. And from that day forward, every creak in the hallway felt like a warning, every shadow a reminder of how close I'd come to becoming a victim. It was a frigid January night in 2018 when I first moved into a quaint little 2-story house in England. Nestled in a quiet cul-de-sac, the houses were so tightly packed that each window practically stared into the next. It was cozy, sure, but there was an eerie silence about the place, a stillness that made me feel as though someone was always watching. I brushed it off as first-night jitters and tried to settle in with my then-boyfriend. I've always been introverted, not one for small talk or social gatherings. A polite nod or a passing hello to the neighbors was my limit. Greg wasn't one to take the hint. He was a middle-aged man with a perpetual grin plastered on his face, the kind of person who'd stop you mid-step for a quick chat that could easily spiral into an hour-long monologue. At first I chalked it up to him being overly friendly, perhaps lonely. He lived directly across the street and his windows had a perfect view of mine. I should have been more cautious. Things began innocently enough. Greg would wave from his window or call out a cheerful good morning. When I stepped outside, he'd remember little details, birthdays, small anecdotes I barely recalled mentioning. Once he invited us to a garden party, claiming everyone was welcome. It felt harmless, even kind. But after my boyfriend moved out 2 years later, things took a darker turn. The breakup was quiet, and I didn't share it with anyone in the neighborhood. Still, Greg must have noticed the absence of my boyfriend's car. His friendly demeanor became something else entirely, constant, intrusive. I adopted a cat to keep me company in the empty house, but even that didn't ease the unsettling feeling of being watched. Greg's encounters with me increased. Every time I left the house, he seemed to appear, flagging me down for another rambling conversation. It became unbearable, and I began texting my ex about Greg's antics. We'd laugh at how absurd they were, until they weren't funny anymore. One evening, I was engrossed in an intense online raid in Elder Scrolls. Greg had offered to bring over a parcel he'd mistakenly collected for me. I told him to leave it by the door. Instead, he let himself in. I heard the door creak open, and heavy footsteps approaching. Turning around, I found Greg standing in my living room, staring at me with a peculiar intensity. I couldn't stop playing mid-raid, so I gestured for him to leave the parcel and go. But he lingered, drunk and overly interested in my gaming setup. "You're amazing at this," he slurred, watching me as though I were performing a magic trick. When the raid finally ended, I walked to the door, opened it, and waited for him to leave. He looked genuinely disappointed as he stumbled out. That moment marked the start of my unease. In the UK, we're all responsible for wheeling out our trash bins for collection and bringing them back in. One morning, I noticed my bins had already been moved back, a favor I hadn't asked for. Days later, I realized someone had been using my bins for their trash. I set up a makeshift surveillance system with an old phone taped to the window. Sure enough, it was Greg. He'd sneak over under the cover of darkness, casually tossing his garbage into my bins. When I mentioned it to him during one of his impromptu driveway chats, he feigned surprise, claiming the same thing was happening to him. I didn't believe him, but I let it go. Confrontation wasn't worth the trouble. Christmas came during the height of the pandemic, and late one evening, there was a knock at my door. Greg stood there with a red gift bag. The smell of alcohol wafted off him as he handed it over. "I really want to give you a kiss on the cheek," he said, swaying slightly. "But I can't, not with the pandemic and all." Before I could react, he leaned in and kissed my cheek anyway. I froze, unable to process what had just happened. The gift bag contained 2 bottles of beer, a half-eaten can of Pringles, and a plastic bag of chocolates. But the chocolates weren't just any chocolates. I recognized them as a homemade gift from my next-door neighbors, meant for their kids to deliver during lockdown. Greg had re-gifted them to me, note and all. I resolved to set boundaries. When Greg knocked at my door 2 days into the new year, I didn't answer. Later that night, he returned, knocking persistently. I ignored him again. By this point, I knew he was watching my house. His visits always coincided with my deliveries. I reported the incidents to the police. They took my statement but asked if I wanted them to confront Greg. Foolishly, I said no. I thought I could handle it. A few days later, Greg showed up again, claiming he was worried about me. I firmly told him we shouldn't have any further contact. His response sent chills down my spine. "I just wanted to be your friend." For months, I thought it was over. Greg seemed to vanish, leaving me to reclaim a sense of normalcy. One winter night, as I locked my door to head out for groceries, I saw it. A shadow slipping out of my driveway and ducking behind the fence. My gut screamed danger. I unlocked the door and went back inside, my heart racing. I told myself it could have been my imagination, but deep down, I knew someone had been waiting for me. A few weeks later, I was feeding my cat when the motion sensor light outside flicked on. Curious, I glanced out the window. At first, I saw nothing, but then, crouched in the shadows, I saw him. Greg was peering into my kitchen window, his face partially obscured by darkness. I screamed, demanding to know what he was doing. Greg didn't flinch. Instead, he stood, calm and composed, and asked, "Are you all right?" I called the police immediately. This time they acted swiftly. Greg was arrested at his home, where I learned he had a wife I'd never seen. Despite his history of following young women, he only received a caution and was forbidden from contacting me or coming near my side of the cul-de-sac. The last time I saw Greg was through my bathroom window. I'd forgotten to close the blinds, and there he was, staring at me from his own house. Since then, I've moved far away, leaving the cul-de-sac and Greg's unsettling presence behind. But even now I catch myself glancing over my shoulder, haunted by the memory of the man who wouldn't let go.